Welcome to the Discover Bittensor podcast. My name is Nick, and the objective of this podcast is very simple: to help normal people understand Bittensor. Because right now, almost nobody does. And I think part of the reason is this: Bittensor is just very hard to explain in one sentence, not because the idea is small, but because the idea is so big. Too big, maybe. If you call it a decentralized AI network, it's not wrong, but I do think this is incomplete. And the more I look at Bittensor, the less it feels like one project. It feels more like a strange and expanding universe, a place where weather forecasting, cloud storage, coding agents, model training, crime detection, fake image detection, scientific prediction, and many other things can all exist under one shared economic system. And if that sounds a little absurd, good, because I think that's the correct reaction. The correct reaction to Bittensor, at least at first, is not, oh yes, of course, another normal thing. The correct reaction is more like, wait, what the hell? What exactly is this? And I think that question matters. Because if Bittensor works, even partially, it may point towards something much bigger than a single cryptocurrency or a single AI app. It may point toward a new way of organizing useful digital work on the internet. And that to me is the real story here. So, in this episode, I want to zoom out. I'm not going to go into the weeds, not yet into validators and emissions and technical terms like that. Those will come later. But this episode is really to introduce you to the huge potential of Bittensor. So today, I really want to stay at the big picture level. Because before you can understand the mechanics of Bittensor, you need to feel the scale of the idea. And the scale of the idea is this: what if intelligence, compute, storage, prediction, and many other forms of digital labor could be organized through open markets rather than only through companies? That's the question. And once you see that question clearly, Bittensor starts to look much less like a niche crypto project and much more like an experiment in a new kind of economic coordination. Let me start with what first made me feel that this thing was different. It wasn't the token, it was not the chart, and also not even the idea that AI is big and is gonna be big. Because everybody already knows this. What struck me was something else. It was the diversity within the Bittensor ecosystem. Because when most people first hear about AI, they imagine one narrow category. They imagine chatbots, language models, image generation, maybe coding assistants. And when you look at Bittensor, you quickly notice that it's not just one market for AI answers. It's an ecosystem of subnets, self-contained incentive systems, where miners compete to produce value and validators evaluate that value. And the official Bittensor documents describe subnets as self-contained incentive systems, which is pretty vague and also at the same time pretty exciting, I would say. And these subnets don't all do the same thing. Some are focused on model training, some on inference, some on storage, some on environmental forecasting, some on agents, some on compliance or fraud related data, and some on media. And that is the first thing that makes Bittensor feel almost limitless. It's not aiming at one narrow output. It's more like a machine for creating many different markets for useful digital work. And once you see that, the whole thing starts to feel different. Because if the same economic architecture can coordinate weather prediction, storage infrastructure, coding agents, and other strange digital industries, then maybe the real product is not any one subnet. Maybe the real product is the coordination system itself. Now, at first glance, all these subnets can feel random, almost messy. At this moment, there's like 128 subnets, and the idea is that eventually there will be thousands of different subnets, okay? And it almost looks messy. One is doing this, another one is doing that, a third one is doing something you barely understand because it's pretty technical. And it's easy to think it's interesting, but also kind of all over the place. But I think there's a hidden pattern. And once you see that pattern, Bittensor becomes much easier to understand. Because underneath the variety, the logic is always more or less the same. A problem is defined, a market is created around that problem, and participants compete to solve it. And the Bittensor network evaluates what's useful, and rewards flow toward the participants producing the most valuable output. That's the pattern. So one subnet might turn weather prediction into an open market. Another might turn storage into an open market. Another might turn model trading into an open market. Like these three are basically subnets Zeus, Hippias, and Templar, three of the Bittensor top subnets at this moment. And I can go on. Another subnet might turn fraud-related data generation into an open market, which there's a subnet called Yanez. Another one might turn coding or agentic task performance into an open market. This one is called Ridges. And the surface changes, but the deeper logic stays the same. And this is the point where I think Bittensor becomes almost philosophically interesting. Because maybe it's not best understood as an AI network, maybe it's better understood as a new way of creating open markets for useful digital work for the 21st century. And that's a much bigger claim. And if that sounds ambitious, good, because it is very ambitious. And, to understand why this matters, you have to look at how AI is currently being built. The frontier of AI today is highly concentrated. OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, Meta. A handful of large organizations are building an extraordinary amount of the most visible and powerful AI infrastructure. And that concentration is exactly the backdrop Bittensor positions itself against. And Bittensor's own introduction frames the project as creating new economies and commodities that are decentralized by design rather than controlled by any single authority. Now, that concentration is not necessarily the result of bad intentions. It's mostly the result of economics. Because training powerful models is very expensive, running compute is expensive, hiring the right people is expensive, and coordinating large-scale research is expensive as well. So what happens? The frontier gets enclosed. And once the frontier gets enclosed, a certain pattern appears. A small number of organizations control the best infrastructure. A small number of organizations control access. And a small number of organizations capture most of the upside. And that leads to a very interesting question. If AI becomes one of the most powerful technologies in human history, is it obvious that the production of intelligence should be coordinated mainly through a small number of closed institutions? Or are there other possible ways? And that's where Bittensor enters. Not with a guarantee or with a proven answer, but with a very realistic alternative. An alternative that says, what if useful intelligence and useful digital work more broadly could be coordinated by open incentives instead? This is where I think it helps to talk about open source, because open source changed the world, quietly, without always getting the credit. Linux powers enormous parts of the internet. Open source libraries sit underneath countless applications, and much of modern software depends on infrastructure most users never even see. That was a huge achievement. Open source solved a big problem: permission. You didn't need a giant company to contribute. You didn't need to be hired first. You didn't need to be invited into a closed room. If you could build something useful, you could build. And that was revolutionary. But open source only partially solved another problem: incentives. A lot of the most important open infrastructure in the world created massive value, but much of that value was captured around the infrastructure rather than inside it. Companies monetize services around Linux. Companies build businesses around open standards, but contributors to foundational infrastructure often captures only a fraction of the upside. Bittensor subnets are democratizing access to things like compute, data, models, and agents, and this could transform both intelligence and the economy. You could even say that Bittensor is an abstraction of Bitcoin's incentive logic into useful work for any digital commodity. That, I think, is exactly the right lens here. Because Bittensor looks like an attempt to combine two very powerful things: the openness of open source collaboration and the incentives of a market. In other words, what if useful contributions to digital infrastructure could be rewarded directly by the protocol itself? It's a very different model from both traditional companies and traditional open source. And if that model works, even in some domains, like compute or agents, the consequences could be enormous. Now let's get to what I think is the most important idea in the whole system. Because this is the part that, if it works, could be really transformative. In the normal world, if you want to work on frontier technology, you usually need permission first. A company has to hire you, a founder has to select you, a manager has to approve you, a university has to credential you, a fund has to back you. And gatekeepers are everywhere, and sometimes that's fine. Sometimes gatekeepers are useful, sometimes quality control matters, But it also means that a huge amount of human talent is excluded by default, by geography, by credentials, by networks, by luck, by access. And Bitensor explores a very different possibility. What if the requirement is not, can you get hired? What if the requirement is, can you improve the system? Then in theory, someone anywhere in the world with the right ID, the right code, the right model, or the right optimization could contribute to a subnet and be rewarded if their contribution is useful. And that's a profound shift. Let me give you an example. There's a subnet called Ridges, and they are building a coding agent, and they just launched their first product version, basically, of this coding agent. And what's intriguing is the following: those last couple of months, the top miner earned a few, let's say, $20,000 or $30,000 per day if they manage to improve the code of this agent. So how does this work? Well, miners, people, permissionless, across the world, they can basically read the code. If they find one line and they can improve this line, making the agent score better on different tasks, validators, they verify this, and if they say yes, this miner actually improved the agent, it improved its performance, the miner gets paid instantly. It's pretty amazing. This miner, by the way, is anonymous. As I said before, no one hired this miner. It can be a 12-year-old person in Belgium. It can be a 70-year-old person in India. It can be anyone, as long as he or she contributes to the network and improves the quality, improves the intelligence of the commodities that are being produced. So let this sink in. This is where it gets really interesting. You can do this for almost any digital work. So I mentioned coding agents, but think about weather prediction. Imagine you are very good at predicting the weather. Well, you use models, and you use those models to very accurately predict weather in certain regions. A certain subnet like Zeus, which is an actual weather prediction subnet on Bitensor right now, can reward you, and you can get paid instantly if you improve the accuracy of the predictions. So those are two examples, and then there are so many more examples to give. It's pretty insane, actually, the potential diversity of different projects you can contribute to here on Bitensor. Useful digital work might become something people can contribute to directly without needing prior institutional permission. That's basically how you could summarize the power of Bitensor, and that is huge. If you stop and think about that for a second, it becomes very hard to see Bitensor as just another crypto asset, because that idea touches something much deeper. It touches the future of work, the future of innovation, the future of opportunity. Now let's come back to that feeling of limitlessness. Why does Bitensor feel so expansive? Well, the answer to me is simple. Because the category it is trying to organize is enormous. It's not trying to create one product. It's not even trying to create one industry. It is trying to create a general framework for incentive-driven digital production. And if that framework works, then in principle, it can be applied to an astonishing variety of domains: model training, inference, agents, storage, prediction, compliance, fraud detection, media analysis, medicine discovery, scientific modeling, and probably many categories nobody has even thought through properly yet. That's why the ecosystem feels so large. It's not because every subnet is magical. It's because the underlying coordination model is general, and general purpose coordination systems tend to be much bigger than the first use cases built on top of them. Bitcoin looked at first like internet money for strange people. Linux looked at first like an operating system project. The internet itself looked at first like a messy network for researchers. Big things often begin by looking narrower than they really are. And Bitensor may be similar. It may look today like, another version of decentralized AI, but underneath that label may be something much broader, a new market architecture for the production of useful digital goods and services. So the metaphor I keep coming back to is this: Bitensor does not feel like a company, it feels like a planet. At first, that planet is sparse, a little strange, not fully mapped. Some cities are still half built, some are chaotic, some may become ghost towns, some may fail completely. But each subnet is like a city with its own local industry. One city may specialize in forecasting, another in storage, another in agents, another in something that sounds niche today but becomes important later. And what makes planets powerful is not that every city becomes a success, it's that the whole economic landscape emerges. Trade appears, specialization appears, capital moves, labor moves, infrastructure develops, unexpected hubs form. And that's what Bitensor can feel like when you zoom out. Not a polished corporation, a planet in formation. And that to me is one of the reasons it captures the imagination. Because planets are much more interesting than products. However, I want to be careful. Because when you zoom out like this, it becomes very easy to drift into fantasy. And I don't want to do that too much. A little bit. Because Bitensor is very early. Extremely early, actually. As I said, many subnets, maybe even most subnets, will fail. Incentive systems will not work well. Some products will never find real demand. And some problems will prove much harder than expected. So there are serious technical, economic, and governance challenges. Like, can usefulness be measured well enough? Can incentive systems resist manipulation? Can real demand emerge beyond internal speculation? Can decentralized systems compete with well-funded centralized counterparts? Those are not minor questions, they are the whole game. And that's why I do not really think the right attitude is hype. The right attitude is something more like fascination. Fascination, almost a form of respect for the idea behind Bitensor. So respect to the founders of Bitensor for their reasoning. Even if Bitensor fails, the attempt itself is extraordinary. It's an attempt to answer one of the biggest questions of the next technological era. Can open markets coordinate useful intelligence and digital work better than closed institutions can? It's not a small question. This is a civilizational question. And that's exactly why I wanted this podcast to exist. Because I think Bitensor sits at the intersection of several very important ideas: artificial intelligence, open systems, economic incentives, digital infrastructure, and the future of how productive work gets organized. And when those things combine, you get the early outline of something historically important. I don't know if Bitensor is going to succeed, and I think anyone pretending certainty here is probably fooling themselves. But I do know this. It's one of the most interesting experiments I've ever seen in how intelligence, infrastructure, and digital work might be coordinated in the future. So, that's it for this episode. In the next episodes, we'll start unpacking the system piece by piece. We'll talk more about different subnets. How do they work? Some inspiring examples of subnets that are live as we speak on Bitensor. Why Tau matters. Why the Tau token has such an essential place within the ecosystem. And many other topics. Thank you for listening. And if you want to explore these concepts further, you can visit my website discoverbittensor.com, where you will find beginner explanations and deeper analysis of this ecosystem. Thanks for listening and welcome to the journey of discovering Bittensor.